Welcome to this Getting Started course for SharePoint 2010 developers. In this module we are going to delve straight into building web parts for SharePoint, as they are perhaps the most common type of development project that you will undertake. Now, when you build a web part, you will effectively build a reusable component that can be used on many different pages and on many different sites. And the great thing about a web part is that it can be very easily added to a web part page by a non-technical user, such as perhaps a project manager or a business unit manager. Now, as a developer, you will use Visual Studio 2010 to create your web parts. For example, you can create a visual web part and design your user interface with a graphical design surface by simply dragging and dropping checkboxes, text boxes, labels and drop-down lists and so forth to your control. Of course, you can also add your own custom business logic in the form of code files to perform some sort of action that interacts with the user. And then you can deploy your web part from Visual Studio because of its tight integration with SharePoint. Visual Studio 2010 has a packaging designer and process that will allow you to press Ctrl plus F5 to package your web part and deploy it to SharePoint. Let's take a look at some examples. First of all, we need to understand that there are two types of web parts supported by SharePoint 2010. We have visual web parts, which allow you to drag and drop controls from the toolbox into a user control, and we have standard ASP.NET web parts, where you will build up your web part interface and logic in a class file. In the first example, we will look at the visual web part type. Visual Studio provides different views of our web part, so you can choose the one that suits you best. What I am showing you is the split view, where we have the graphical design surface near the bottom of the screen and the source or markup near the top of the screen. We can use the toolbox and drag and drop controls to either of these panes, and from there we can use the properties window to set properties, or we can type property values directly into the markup. In this example, we have a simple ASP.NET label called message, and if we look at the code behind, we can actually add our own code as well. So we will set the text property of that label, which was called message, to a suitable welcome message. In this case, we will say, "Welcome to SharePoint 2010 development." Now we can deploy our web part very straightforwardly by pressing Ctrl and F5 from Visual Studio, and this will package and deploy the web part. We can then add it to a web part page with a few simple clicks. So this is what our web part looks like. We have our message that says "Welcome to SharePoint development." Now let's take a look at a standard web part example. A standard web part does not have a design surface as such, so we will build our visual user interface in code. The important thing to note is that a standard web part inherits from the ASP.NET web part base class. So what we will do is typically override the createChildControls method, and in our code we start interacting with the SharePoint object model. So I am retrieving the user's name from the SharePoint object model via spcontext.current.web.currentUser, and I can store that in my string variable. Then I can start adding ASP.NET controls, and in this case I am building a literal control called myMessage. And in its constructor I will set its text value equal to the value that we have retrieved from SharePoint plus my welcome string. So we will say welcome username to SharePoint development. And very importantly, we must then add this control to the control tree, and we do this via this.controls.add. That's very important for ASP.NET controls, especially if they have server-side events. Again, I can press Ctrl plus F5 and with a few clicks add my web part to a web part page in SharePoint. And this is the result. We have retrieved the currently logged on user's name, Andy J, from SharePoint and have used that in our welcome message. So this has been a very brief introduction to web parts, but hopefully you can see how easy it is to get started. We will delve further into web parts and the object model in later videos.